today because the President of the United States and his allies have engaged in an unprecedented, escalating, and unlawful attempt to undermine the Federal Reserve's independence and seize control of our central bank. Since he took office in January, Trump has repeatedly sought to undermine Fed Chair Jerome Powell with public insults, accusations, and threats of removal. Trump repeatedly blamed Chair Powell for not cutting rates quickly enough and is using the Fed as a scapegoat for economic problems created by Trump's own disastrous economic policies. It is Trump's tariffs and cuts to federal programs that have led to rising inflation and a worsening economy and the Fed's actions. When the attacks on Chair Powell didn't stick, Trump turned to attempting to fire a Fed governor, Dr. Lisa Cook, based on unproven allegations and without proper due process. Dr. Cook has filed a lawsuit which is being heard in the United States District Court for the District of Columbia. In two separate rulings so far, the court has stood on the side of Dr. Cook. So I'm pleased the courts are standing on the right side of this issue so far, but this is not the end of the court battle, as the Trump administration will surely pursue this all the way to the Supreme Court. If Trump is ultimately successful in ousting Dr. Cook, Trump's actions could lead to unprecedented levels of high inflation and undermine the savings, retirement funds, and wages of hardworking families. And so, before I turn to our members, let me just be sure that I welcome the Honorable Dr. Lael Brainard, the former chair and board member of the Federal Reserve, former director of the National Economic Council, and former Undersecretary of the United States Treasury for International Affairs. Thank you so very much for being with us today. We appreciate your presence and we appreciate your service. Thank you. So I'm going to start with Mr. Vargas. I will now turn it over to you as the ranking member of the Task Force on Monetary Policy, Treasury, Market Resilience, and Economic Prosperity for your brief opening remarks.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Madam Chair. I appreciate that. And of course, Dr. Brainard, thank you so much for being here. As you mentioned this afternoon, our task force on the monetary policy, treasury, market, resilience, and economic prosperity is going to hold a hearing on the Fed's independence and the dual mandates. The Fed's dual mandate is critical to addressing the key way that most Americans experience the economy, which is through a job. High unemployment rates hit those living on the edge the hardest, and the Fed has a pivotal role to play in maintaining a healthy labor market. But the Fed needs to remain independent to best execute its dual mandate. And the President Trump, obviously, as we heard, is attempting to illegally fire Dr. Cook. In fact, some of the information that we're seeing quite clearly says she did nothing wrong, and this is what he would call a witch hunt. He's actually the one doing the hunting. And so, again, I think the court cases were well described here, and we won't allow that to happen. She won't allow that to happen. But on Monday, the Senate did confirm Stephen Moran, the chair of the White House Council on Economic Advisors, to serve on the Fed's board. And while he is on an unpaid leave, he will still effectively be answering to the president if he wants to get his job back at the White House. So when we see President Trump attempting to remove Dr. Cook while successfully installing his own White House employees, there's little doubt that the President Trump wants to take over the Fed for his political gain. It's very, very dangerous to have an institution like the Fed, a central bank, not be independent, and we have to push back. Thank you, Madam.
Thank you very much. Now that we have most of our members here, I'm going to go back and start with our very special guest today. I want to make sure that we know who is here and why she's here and what she hopes to bring to us today. Today we have again, if I may reiterate, the honor of being joined by the Honorable Dr. Lael Brainard. to help us better understand the consequences of Trump's attempts to undermine Fed independence and what we can do in Congress to advocate for strong Fed independence. Dr. Brainard, again, if I may, tell you, has a distinguished career of public service. She has served as a former vice chair and board member of the Federal Reserve, former director of the National Economic Council, and former undersecretary of the United States Treasury for International Affairs. Allow me to again welcome you and thank you, Dr. Brainard, for being here. I will now turn it over to you for some brief opening remarks.
Well, first of all, I really appreciate the opportunity to come and talk with you about this important issue, and I really appreciate all that all of you have been doing, ranking member and members of the committee, to shine a light on just how unprecedented and really harmful the president's approach to the Federal Reserve has been, how completely unprecedented. In terms of why did Congress give the Federal Reserve some limited amount of independence, it did so because it has seen over 100 years or more around many countries that when there is not an independent central bank, it leads to higher inflation. It's just bad for Americans. Higher inflation, higher rates on things like mortgages, worse outcomes in the economy. With the most recent example we have in the United States resulted in the Great Inflation. So when Nixon wanted to juice the economy before the 1972 election and put enormous pressure on then Chair Arthur Burns, they got a short-term reduction in unemployment and interest rates. But then inflation started to rise and really didn't stop. So if you look at what happened, inflation fell from 3% to 11% 3 years later, and then climbed above 13% by the end of the decade. Of course, there were also oil price shocks, but there was a perception that the Fed had lost control. Unemployment went up from 5% to nearly 10% in 1975, and then even further in 1982. And long-term interest rates soared, making things like mortgages and interest payments on the national debt much more expensive. The other thing that happens when the Federal Reserve doesn't have independence and is subject to political pressure from the White House is that people start expecting inflation to stay high, and it makes it much harder to bring inflation down. So we just went through a surge in inflation from the supply shocks of the pandemic, and you saw that we were able to bring inflation back down. The unemployment rate never budged above 4.2, 4.3%. The contrast with Paul Volcker is very striking. He needed to let unemployment soar to double digits before inflation came down. So there's a long-term cost, and that is really what's at stake today. I think the ranking member was very clear on why does the president want to put all this pressure on the Fed right now. It appears pretty clear that this administration has a set of policies that are quite stagflationary. They passed this massive bill, this massive tax cut, which means it's a $4 trillion addition to the national debt. In order to replace some of those revenues, they've got very high Smoot-Hawley level tariffs, which are essentially a tax on American consumers. Those lead to higher inflation and lower employment. And so to counter that and to lower the cost of servicing the national debt, the president has been very clearly pushing the Fed to lower interest rates. And he's been very explicit. He says every percentage point saves me $300 billion in servicing. And so he's called for interest rates to come down to 1 percentage point. Nobody is talking about that as being a reasonable place for interest rates to be right now in order to save $1 trillion in debt service. And I think just briefly before I end, the ways that he is pressuring the Fed are really in a category of their own. We of course, the White House always wants to see low interest rates, but the things that this administration has been willing to do are really unusual. So first, just threatening to flat out fire the chair. There was a big negative market reaction, and so instead the president went over to the Federal Reserve and, suggested that somehow there was some malfeasance associated with the renovations. When that didn't work, the administration started focusing on obtaining a majority of the board instead. And suddenly, Governor Kugler left 4 months before the end of her term, right? And that created a slot for the administration to put an additional person. They already had 2 appointees. This gave them potential for a third. And of course, it's a 7-member board. They need 4 to get a majority. So the astonishing thing is they quickly put forward Stephen Moran, the head of the CEA, and he said he wasn't going to leave his post at the White House. That has never happened before. And he got quickly confirmed, and he is now voting on monetary policy as we speak, without going off the payroll of the White House. So if that's not a violation of independence, you really have to ask what the authors of the Federal Reserve Act had in mind. Then fourth, as was mentioned, the president summarily fired Governor Cook based on a tweet from the head of the FHFA associated with mortgage fraud. As you know, the threshold for firing a member of the Federal Reserve Board is for cause. And that's never been defined before because it's never really happened before. But surely if you had a great deal of concern about showing that this was a warranted firing, you would go through a process to show cause. No process, no evidence, summarily fired. And now, of course, we've seen 2 court decisions saying, well, you need to have due process at minimum, and there has been none here. So trying to get a majority of the board. Now, what's odd, of course, is what is the urgency? Why not wait till Kugler's term ends? Why not go through a due process? Well, there is, in February, the reappointment of all of the Reserve Bank presidents. And, of course, to have a majority of the FOMC, you do need some votes from the Reserve Bank presidents if you have 4 members of the board. And you'll remember that the law says in years ending in 1 and 6, all 12 of them need to be reappointed, and the board of governors gets to approve those. And so that is also a question mark. We haven't seen anything yet there, but I think there's a concern that there is urgency to get a majority by February in order to take a very unprecedented step of disapproving some of those present. I don't know that, but it is interesting. So I think that's kind of the broad backdrop of why we might be very, very concerned that the Federal Reserve independence is going to be severely undermined. And it's not just a today issue. It takes a lot of years to build up in credibility and inflation fighting. We saw that. It didn't happen immediately for Paul Volcker. It took a lot of years. And it will put it'll put the American people at risk of many years of higher inflation, higher interest rates, and worse employment outcomes if this is allowed to stand. So let me just finish with that.
Well, thank you so very much. And now I would like to open up the question and answer portion of this briefing. And I'll start with a question to you, Dr. Brainard. Earlier this week, the Senate confirmed Stephen Moran as a Fed governor after the sudden departure of Governor Adriana Kugler. Importantly, Mr. Moran has been serving as the chair of the White House Council on Economic Advisors, or CE-A, during this administration, and said he will not step down from that position while at the Fed, but rather will only take a leave of absence. This presents a clear conflict of interest because Mr. Myron's primary focus will be to keep his position on the CEA, where Trump would maintain total discretion to fire him during his term at the Fed. So, it's not just the attempted firing of Dr. Cook we must be concerned about. Trump, now with the help of the Republican Senate, would appear to have an insider on the Fed board. As a member of the Fed board and later as a director in the White House, you are uniquely qualified to describe what is at stake and why the Fed's independence is so important. Can you help explain to the American public why interest rates set by the Fed can be so impactful for them and why decisions about those rates need to be based on sound economic data?
Yeah. So I think the concern is that we have seen in many countries around the world, places like Turkey now, Argentina, Venezuela, when the president of the country gets to essentially tell the central bank what to do with interest rates, you get periods where interest rates are cut, inflation soars, and eventually the central bank loses control of the inflation process because people simply expect that the central bank will be told what to do by the person who has political interest in juicing the economy for a short time until their election, and that leads to very bad outcomes. And so this unprecedented arrangement, it's not something that I could imagine during my time serving both at the White House and at the Federal Reserve. It was extremely important. We understood that when you are at the Federal Reserve, it is your independent assessment of inflation, employment, the economy that are essential, and that there is a very important dividing line between the executive branch and the Federal Reserve. This arrangement violates that and presents, as you mentioned, a clear conflict of interest with somebody who is now on the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve, planning to potentially return to work for the president, and therefore not truly being able to demonstrate that his assessment is independent of that potential return.
Absolutely. Mr. Vargas.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess two things. But the first one, you described the issue of the presidents of the bank and how that was going to fit into this. Could you go over that in a little more detail? Give you a little more time on it. I think that's important.
Yeah. So I think it's Section 4 of the Federal Reserve Act says that all of the presidents of the reserve banks in years ending in 1 and 6 must be reappointed for 5-year terms. And the recommendation comes from the board of directors of each of those reserve banks, but the board of governors approves that slate, approves each of those appointments. I don't think there's been a case where the Board of Governors has actually rejected those reappointments or appointments in the past. But of course, it is the prerogative of the Board of Governors to do so. And so one of the concerns about the urgency to essentially secure a majority of the Board of Governors is that that vote too could then become contentious and lead to the president's ability to exert influence on the composition of the Reserve Bank presidents, which statutorily has not been the case and is not the design of the FOMC.
So I thought that the other thing that you talked about, obviously, when Nixon pressured Burns on the interest rates, and obviously created stagflation. That was in the 70s, though. We were looking at the issue, which is one of the issues that we looked at, but we were also looking at Turkey, because Erdogan did something very similar. And I think their inflation shot up to 85%.
That's exactly right. So the current day best example is President Erdogan in Turkey, who has essentially put inordinate pressure on the central bank, has replaced the head of the central bank when interest rate policy didn't follow his preferred course. And the result has been a ratcheting up of both inflation and interest rates. And I think one of the things that's just important to recognize is while the president has said that he wants the Federal Reserve to cut the overnight rate, the federal funds rate, by 3 percentage points because it'll save a lot on long-term interest rates. The reality is that if investors think the result of that is that inflation is going to remain higher over time, mortgage rates and rates on 10-year treasuries will actually go up because they're going to ask for more return to be compensated for their expectation that inflation is just going to stay higher for longer. And that's why that just doesn't work. We saw that in the 1970s. We see it in Turkey today. And so if the Federal Reserve loses its credibility, people just expect inflation to go up.
Those are my questions.
Thank you. Mr. Sherman.
The Fed's in a difficult position because the big, bad, beautiful bill is so fiscally irresponsible that you have these huge deficits. America's competing for capital. And look, we tell businesses we're a high-wage country. We aspire to have tough environmental standards. But what we do is we offer predictable policy, an independent Fed, and the rule of law. And now I think people are saying not so much on those things. And we begin to look more like Turkey. What you might be interested in is this afternoon, the Republicans are having this hearing of the task force designed to perhaps strip away the dual mandate and just go with an interest rate mandate, with a price stability mandate. And not only is that bad for jobs, but Trump is pushing in one direction, the Republicans are pushing in the other direction, and so in a way they're threatening our jobs because our job is to oppose Donald Trump, and when the Republicans start doing that, but perhaps you can talk to us about the importance of having a dual mandate, where we look not only at trying to have the minimum inflation rate, but the minimum unemployment rate. And what happens if we just focus on one?
Well, I think the point that you're making is really important. I don't understand why the Republican members who are very supportive of the president actually want to suggest that right now they should focus only on inflation, because if the Federal Reserve had a single mandate on inflation only, because of the tariffs, inflation, which was moving down towards 2.5%, is back close now to 3 and is going higher. And the only reason that they will be cutting today, which I anticipate they will do, is because the labor market is wobbly. It's softening. And so it is, as you say, very confusing that they would suggest that right now, when the president is doing everything he can to get rates down, they are pushing for an inflation mandate, which would, because inflation is close to 3 and rising, going in the wrong direction, which would require them to keep rates higher or potentially raise them. So it's very strange. And of course, as you say, our dual mandate has served us extremely well. I think Representative Augustus Hawkins, when he talked about why this dual mandate was so important, why full employment, maximum employment, he talked about how important it was to have a strong labor market to bring everybody into the labor market, people that otherwise would not be able to secure jobs as easily, to have a really full employment set of opportunities. And we've seen over many years now how well that's served us at a time when inflation has remained remarkably low and stable for the large majority of the last several decades.
Absolutely. Mr. Lynch.
Thank you. Dr. Brainard, first of all, I was here prior to 2008, when your wonderful advice was ignored by so many, but you tried to warn Congress, and I just want to say thank you for your political courage back then, and it's a good reason to have you with us today. Trump is doing a sort of a full spectrum politicization, not only of the Fed, but Department of Justice. He's politicizing the military by, putting them on the streets of Los Angeles and here in Washington D.C. He fired Erica McIntyre over at BLS because she announced bad job numbers. Mm-hmm. So there's an erosion going on here across the government where the president is trying to exert control that is not authorized under the Constitution or statutory law. And you point to the example of Erdogan, where he took control of the central bank there in Turkey, and he had a huge construction. I was there at the time when he did all that. He had a construction program for building hundreds of miles of rapid transit, and he wanted all that to go forward. But in the end, he undermined his own currency. And I was wondering if you could just talk to the issue of the U.S. markets. The reason for our success is the trust and the integrity of the job numbers that the BLS put out, the integrity of the decisions being made by the Fed, that not just the domestic markets but global markets know that we're not fudging those numbers until now, because now I think there's a loss of trust, a loss of integrity because of the corrosion that's going on at the hands of this president. If you could just talk about what might happen over the longer term, not just with the economic numbers, but with our reputational damage that might result.
So the dollar is globally dominant, as you know, and that is not because of some official status that it has. It is because investors all around the world want to hold dollar assets. They want to hold treasuries because they have confidence. They've seen it over many, many years now, that when they want to convert their treasuries into cash, they'll be able to do so, and those treasuries will hold their value because inflation will stay low, the dollar will stay stable, and those assumptions are predicated on the rule of law, the integrity of our institutions, the credibility of our institutional setup internationally. And what that means is that we borrow more cheaply. So some estimates have estimated that we save between $140 billion to $200 billion in terms of our international investors holding on to Treasury securities, because they're willing to hold those at a lower interest rate because they have so much confidence that the dollar's going to remain strong and they're going to be able to monetize those, to liquidate them at moments of stress. When other countries see investors moving away from their securities at moments of stress, people move towards the dollar. And that's a lot of money to give up because the president decides that he is going to attack the fundamental independence of the Federal Reserve, go after the rule of law more generally, really upend international agreements on tariffs, and undermine the potential gold standard statistics that we've been relying on at our independent statistical agencies. All of those things over time could corrode that advantage that we have.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Green,
Thank you, Madam Chair.
welcome.
Thank you. Honor to be with you. And thank you for being with us today. You touched upon much of what I wanted to have you give some explication on, but as the reserve currency of choice, the dollar, the preeminent currency, it also allows us to impose sanctions because of its preeminence. How will this impact the ability to impose sanctions? And also, how does this impact our dollar as in this war for currency supremacy? As you know, China and others have been trying to move the dollar out of its place as the currency of choice. And finally, municipal bonds. How does this impact municipal bonds? I've got a city that is in need of selling bonds, and this would be something that they would be exceedingly interested in.
Yeah. Well, it is the case that our dollar preeminence, the fact that the dollar is used in 90% of trade transactions around the world, it is by far the biggest currency used for collateral and financial transactions internationally. All of those things mean that the dollar payment system around the world is the one that most entities use, and that gives us this incredibly powerful tool for national security purposes to really be able to track flows and then to sanction those flows. And we saw that when Russia invaded Ukraine. The ability to put those sanctions on was incredibly powerful national security tool that we have, and it is because the dollar is dominant. But we can't just assume that the dollar is always going to be as dominant as it is. China is actively working to establish an alternative payment system. It is establishing a set of norms and standards around central bank digital currencies to promote its digital yuan. There are a whole variety of things that other countries are doing to diminish reliance on the dollar. So at a moment like this, seems to me, we should be trying to preserve those incumbency advantages and to really strengthen our commitment to the institutions that are underlying it, the Federal Reserve's independence being one of the most important ones, rule of law also important, in order to maintain that dollar dominance and the privileges that we get from lower interest rates and from sanctions for as long as we possibly can, hopefully indefinitely. And with regard to municipals, I presume that if we saw a real increase in longer term Treasury yields, which, you know, I don't know if it'll happen. I certainly don't know when it would happen. But over time, you could expect that. That will also make it more expensive for municipalities to continue borrowing. And of course, for people, homeowners, to borrow with mortgages. Any long-term rates in the U.S. will be adversely affected.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Beatty.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this, and thank you certainly for you being here. I was going to piggyback, but I think you answered enough for me Vargas's question on what other presidents had done, whether that was Kennedy or Johnson, asking the feds to cut interest rates or to raise them. I remember during the Vietnam War, there was a big issue publicly about the interest rates, but none of those presidents have been as public with it or as forceful for that. So let me shift gears. We know now from data that we're receiving from EEO and labor statistics that black women are disproportionately in those numbers with a 6.7% unemployment rate now, extremely high. And I know Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley has raised this issue as the first DE&I chair by Congresswoman Waters. It's important for me. A recent article with a chief statistician with the United States Department of Labor, Peggy Carr, 35 years of being on the front lines was by this administration terminated. And when you look at the number of women like her, black women like her, who have been terminated, I guess my question comes back, being a female, where are our voices, or what tools are there for us? You know, we are witnessing in real time my very dear friend, Lisa Cook, and what's happening to her. And I could give you a list, as you well know, and how hard we fought to get minorities on the Federal Reserve. And black members, I can take you back to legislation that I wrote early in my career and talk to you about it, that we only had one black person as a president of the Federal Reserve, and that was in Atlanta, and it was a black male. And term after term, I did the Beatty rule, patterned after the Rooney rule, to make history. So this is not only professional, but it's very personal to me that I have dedicated my life to this. So is there any wisdom or tools that you can shed on that? And I know my good sister and friend who has repeatedly been out here with a strong voice on this. So I have made many notes to bring that up.
Well, I know how much work you've done on this issue over the years, and the creation of the OMWI and the Dodd-Frank Act. I mean, really important progress has been made, although it's been very difficult to make that progress. I think it's striking that I think we all know all the names of Black people that have served either on the board or as president of the Federal Reserve, because there are so few. I mean, literally,
Exactly.
we can name them all because there have been so few. And it is the case that Raphael Bostic was the first
Atlanta, Georgia.
Black
Right.
president. There had been 3 Black men, very distinguished on the Federal Reserve Board by then. He was the first. Took a lot of doing to get there. And we got Susan Collins, first Black woman, took a lot of doing, and Lisa Cook. And then Adriana Kugler, first Hispanic member of the board ever.
And I don't say, and I've met with every one of them, and we're all friends. So you're right, we know them, and I have to just interject this. But for Maxine Waters and the section in Dodd-Frank on OMWI, and the questions in the roundtables repeatedly, and that's why it's important for me to continue to ask this, we wouldn't be sitting here today having those answers.
No, it really has required a very protracted set of actions over many years. And of course, that is now very much, I think, at risk. Now, you know, for people who might have a different view on this, why is it important? One of the reasons it's important is because the research says that if you do not have diversity in these decision-making tables, you end up with worse outcomes. I mean, there's just great experimental research and empirical research in the economics discipline and other disciplines that just says a diversity of backgrounds and life experiences leads to better debate and better decision-making. And so even if you didn't buy all the rest of the importance of representation, which some people unfortunately today do not, you would still, in order to have the best possible monetary policy for the United States, think that it was important. The other thing that I think you pointed out also is that as we see that heads of statistical agencies are being fired when the news is bad, it also should lead us to have some concern that the kinds of statistics that we need in order to see how Black women are doing in the labor market as opposed to other demographic groups, some of those statistics are extremely important for reading the economy and addressing those kinds of very persistent structural differences. And I hope that we'll continue to have that very high quality detailed statistics available to us.
Oh, thank you. Ms. Preston.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Very appropriate to follow my dear sister here, Congresswoman Beatty. I follow her anywhere. And it's a perfect segue to my question. I submitted a letter to Chairman Powell calling for an analyzing of the data and a plan to be developed given that the unemployment for Black women is at 5.7%. I'd be hard-pressed to identify any other group that could be 320,000 pushed out of the public and private sector in a 6-month period, and that not be sounding all kinds of alarms for what this means for the economy when the overall unemployment is at 4.3%. So, we've, put out a deadline of September 30th for that data analysis and a plan. So my question is it possible that they can obscure any data? And other than interest rates, what other tools do we have around unemployment? And then separate and apart from that, but I guess related. You know, unprecedented continues to be the word du jour. I'm ready for some precedented times. I don't know about the rest of y'all, but it seems that we're on this slippery slope. What is the bright red line what is the scenario that we need to be looking out for? That means that we have crossed into an official federal, an official takeover of the Fed.
So, just in terms of the statistics, you know, when you see an unemployment rate for a group that is as large and important in the labor market as Black women go up as quickly, that raises alarms. And so, you know, a Federal Reserve that has a dual mandate, has the responsibility for understanding and acting to prevent big surges in unemployment, would look at that data very carefully, because what we've learned is that groups like Black men and Black women tend to see unemployment rise first. And so in some ways, by looking at that data, it can tell us that the larger labor market is weaker than maybe we think it is. Mm-hmm. So it's actually really important, we have learned empirically, to look at subcategories and understand young people versus old people, men, women, different demographic groups, because it does tell you a little bit of a story about what potentially is going on underneath the hood. And so the Fed spent several years adding analysis to its discussion of monetary policy, to its external publications, recognizing that this was really warranted by the research. And I've seen some of that go away, and I hope it will not be jeopardized. In terms of red lines, so the question a little bit is, well, where does the pushback come from, right? So Congress, the courts, and the markets. Obviously, Congress is, the majority is holding a hearing on the dual mandate rather than on the independence of the Fed. So that is a problem. And we just saw that a member of the chair of the President's Council of Economic Advisors was essentially confirmed to be on the Fed. So that pushback, normally Congress is very strong on keeping the White House out of the business of the Fed. So that is really different right now. The courts, we have to wait and see, right? But on the other independent agencies, what has happened there would give me some concern that if this issue goes all the way to the Supreme Court, they may take just a different view about the unitary executive and its role in the Federal Reserve. So that would be a huge red line if that were crossed, because it would really throw it back to Congress to pass new legislation to demarcate that. And then the markets did react early on. There was a period of very high volatility. It was short-lived, and the president did change his position. But you can't really rely on the markets because sometimes it takes a long time for there to be a market reaction. And sometimes it doesn't come for many years. And so I worry that you're not going to see the markets respond in a way that would prevent those red lines being irrevocably crossed.
Thank you, Doctor.
Ms. Garcia.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on that note. Is there any other guardrails that you think we can work on in addition? Because it seems like Congress, at least the majority of folks, seem to not be bothered by giving up some of our constitutional authority and power and oversight. And we can't wait forever for the courts, and I for one, would not want to rely on the market. So is there any other guardrails that you would recommend that we start working on proactively so that we can make sure that this president doesn't accomplish his goal and that any future president does not, and that we maintain the independence of the Federal Reserve Board?
I do think that as we saw in a recent op-ed by Phil Gramm and Jeb Hensarling, there's some retired members of Congress who are Republicans who traditionally did stand up and talk about the independence of the Federal Reserve. I think getting some more of those voices out there. I mean, that op-ed, I think, put a lot of the right arguments on the table from a sort of Republican perspective, and makes it a little bit more difficult for their current serving sort of colleagues not to explain why this power that Congress delegated to the Fed, not to the executive branch, is now being appropriated by the executive branch. The business community, some of the financial leaders normally would be speaking up because this goes directly to their business. And it, I believe, is a matter of concern for them. But I think what we've seen is they too are worried about delivering public messages because of potential
Retribution, you can use the word.
effects on their business, yes. But at least engaging with them and asking them to deliver private messages, I think, might be helpful. As well as small businesses, this will hurt them if.
But anything that we should think about in terms of legislation?
Well, I think it may be necessary, for instance, to clarify who would have thought that a member of the president's staff shouldn't also serve on the Federal Reserve Board. That might be good legislation because it would be hard not to vote for that legislation, I think. So yes, I think there might be some things in the area of legislation that would send a powerful signal.
Well, we've seen that the tariffs and some of his actions and some of his legislation have already had an impact on unemployment numbers, on different economic factors. If this were a normal world, and it's not, how long will it take after he takes over the Fed for us to get into a position like so many other countries that tamper with the Fed? I mean, when are we going to see inflation so high that we'll be in competition with Turkey and Argentina and all these other countries that have?
Yeah.
Because we've already seen some changes.
We have. And of course, the tariffs haven't worked their way through fully into prices at stores yet because a lot of smart companies brought in huge inventories.
It's impacting housing.
It is
Construction costs.
It is
labor
certainly
shortage because of deportations.
That's exactly right. The combination, I think, is so. My sense is that the inflation could be tempered by the fact that the economy is slowing. And so it's not clear yet whether inflation really is going to heat up a lot in the near term, or whether you're going to see much more slowing on the labor market. And that's, I think, the tension that we are confronting today. But it is possible that next year you will start to see inflation really rise. And at that juncture, hopefully, the administration will give the Fed the room to do what it needs to do in order to actually keep inflation under control.
And just one quick last one. You mentioned Diana Kugler. I know she resigned, and I was surprised. But was there anything there hidden about her resignation? Was she pushed out, pressured out?
I don't know anything about the particulars.
Because it seems like hers happened, and then Cook's happened. It seems like he targeted the minority members.
It is surprising that that she left early. She gave no indication that she was going to leave early, and had not indicated to any of her colleagues even days earlier that she was thinking about leaving. That's all I know.
Did anybody ask about that? What's the outlook for the next quarter?
For the next
quarter.
For the next
What
quarter.
I call the Christmas quarter.
So I think, consumers are still pretty okay, right? We just saw retail sales. They're out there. They're buying back to school. I presume they'll be buying Christmas stuff soon. So interestingly, consumers are holding up.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. You've been so kind. But I can't let you leave here without talking about what is going on today at the Fed Open Markets meeting, where based on I don't know what, am anticipating a reduction in the short-term interest rate. What do you know that we should know?
Well, I should say that I don't have any inside information about how the FOMC is deliberating. I read what you read, but it does seem that what Chair Powell said at Jackson Hole is that his concern and the committee's concern was shifting from rising inflation to the weakening labor market, And the most recent employment report really would give him no reason to shift back, because it did seem that the rate of job creation is much, much lower than we expected it to be. Now, some of that's because of all the deportations and the fact that the labor
Yes.
supply has shrunk.
Yeah,
So it's a little hard to read, but I do anticipate that they will lower rates today.
1/4.
25, yes,
Yes.
by 1/4 of a percentage point.
That's right.
But what will be interesting is, are there dissents in favor of half a percentage point? Are there dissents on the other side in terms of holding firm? And what will also be interesting is to see the new projections, the forecasts from the Federal Open Markets Committee members, and of course, whether the newest member, Stephen Moran, will submit a forecast, and whether it'll be so different that you'll notice it, because as you know, they're anonymous. So those will be things that I think market journalists will be watching very
Got my
carefully.
fingers crossed for the 1/4.
Yes, I think the 1/4 is extremely likely.
Yeah, well, that would be very good. I think that would quieten some of the noise from the Oval Office. Well, thank you so very much. It's so
Thank you.
interesting.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity.
And you have so much information, and we have to stay in touch with you. And thank you for being here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Thank
members.
you.
Yes,
Thank you.
Appreciate your
Thank you
time.
very much.